Good afternoon. This is the Familiar Company podcast. Today is an amazing episode. It was such a privilege to spend the day with this man. Mnemonic Entity joined us today to talk about psychedelics and recovery. Please, I hope you enjoyed as much as we did. Here we go. Let's get started. Hello. I'm going to edit in the intro and stuff later, so it doesn't matter too much. I figured it'd make it more casual. I got tired of doing the intros during the recording. It doesn't feel natural. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I can appreciate that. Yeah, you just kind of want to get into it, right?
Of course, man. So mnemonic. What does psychedelics mean to you, dude? For real.
Oh gosh, they mean a lot of different things. I would say that fundamentally, so I really like David Nichols. He was one of the neuroscientists who worked with Sasha Shulgin, who wrote Phenethylamines I Know and Loved, and I Have Known and Loved, and Tryptamines I've Known and Loved, which are both kind of classic works of psychonautic exploration. He got asked the question when he was working in as an expert witness, why do people take psychedelics? And I loved his answer because it's so simple, which is people take psychedelics because it feels important.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's really something to that, because it does. It's funny. Every time you get away from them, whenever you take them again, it's like there's always this feeling of I didn't quite know what I was signing up for. Like it never feels like there's no way of being a sober human being and just knowing what you're signing up for when you take psychedelics, because you're just not in that space.
Right.
So for me, psychedelics are a window into a world without filters, a world without compartments and boundaries, psychological and perceptual. Psychedelics are a way of unlocking the Pandora's box of the mind.
Definitely.
For great felicity and for great suffering.
That was a really good example, Pandora's box. I like that.
That's what it is. I mean, this is the thing that I tell people, because you can give two people the exact same dose, like that with David Nichols, that story I was telling where he was an expert witness. He was an expert witness on a case where this guy was at like a Fish concert or something like that, and he got really tripped out, took off all of his clothes, and he was running around, and when the cops got a hold of him, they sicked an attack dog on him, and then they hogtied him in the mud for like 4 hours. And he died. And when they brought him to the hospital to test his blood, all he had was THC and LSD. That was it.
Good God.
And it's that sort of thing that really shows you just how profoundly important the place and the way that you open that Pandora's box is. That this sort of casual recreational culture that is built around psychedelics, because they've been made illegal, is toxic and risky and dangerous, and it's a whole lot of fun, because toxic, risky, and dangerous are a classic combination for very fun things, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's the birth of humanity. It's our favorite cocktail.
Yeah, no, there's a darkness to we crave a way to expend our youth proving ourselves, right? That's how all of the ancient tribal societies that humanity emerged from, that's how they did it, is they would have these coming of age rituals that were incredibly challenging and stressful. And in lieu of that, we've developed this party culture where people starve themselves of sleep. They engage in very physiologically stressful activities, and they compete with each other about it. This happens in the psychedelic culture a whole lot, where people are like, "Well, I took this one. Well, I took this one. Well, I mixed it with ecstasy. Well,
Yeah.
It's
Becomes
just
a
one thing
measuring
after
contest.
another. It's proving yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That's fundamentally what it's about. Is
Yeah.
that it gives you this sense of sort of hardening, of development, I guess,
Also.
that we crave. It's like a challenge that
Mm-hmm.
we crave.
Absolutely
So there's
agree.
that too. So that's another aspect of it. I'm unpacking it as I talk with you about it.
Have
But
at
that
it, man.
psychedelics. So for me, it's an unlocking, but it's also a challenge. It's every time I take them, I plan on challenging myself. I plan on confronting myself
Yeah.
with myself and with the world as it is. And it's strange because in some ways it warps your perception, but in other ways it clarifies it, I find.
Oh God, yeah, absolutely.
Because there's the ways that psychedelics improve. So so when they do neuroimaging studies of psychedelics, what you'll find is that uh, you can have a normal sober person listening to a song, and then you can have a person on LSD listening to a song, and the normal person will just have like their auditory cortices kind of running a little bit, maybe a little bit of sparks of activity, and then the LSD person is just this crazy Christmas tree of just like all these different things going on in all these different associative areas, and what it is it's causing this global activation that we normally only see in completely novel situations.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, another way of putting it is that psychedelics turn the entirety of reality into art.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the example you said earlier, would you compare it to like synesthesia, where individual can have hallucinations and deep visualizations from music without drugs, and it kind of like the psychedelic induces that kind of experience for somebody who doesn't have synesthesia.
It definitely it does not only decompartmentalize your thinking and emotions, but it decompartmentalizes your senses. So
Yeah.
yes, you'll have a sound that will cause other senses to start firing off.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Uh,
I've experienced things like that. Like I'll never forget one time that a song tasted like apple pie. I think that's the only time I've ever had a song taste like anything. It was
Whoa.
weird, but specifically apple pie, and it wasn't a song that I thought of as sounding like apple pie or anything. It was just like apple pie. Here you go.
Yeah, our brain
Um,
connects weird dots, you know?
well, and that's the thing is that psychedelics, um, they kind of force this emergence in connections
Hmm.
in the way that they kind of allow for a mixing of all of your senses because it's basically so the way that my running theory is that psychedelics bolster non-linear thinking. So there's
Mm.
linear thinking, which is where you have one thing after another, like the words in this sentence. I'm feeding you in sequence a linear process of information. Um, and then there's paying attention to my expressions on my face, the intonations of my voice, and all these other things that create this layered, non-linear presentation of information. Um, and that part of it, the non-linear presentation, gets amplified with psychedelics at, I would say, at the expense of the linear processing. So
Definitely.
you can have someone expressing themselves very eloquently one moment and then literally forget what they're talking about the next, because they're not able to keep that solid train of thought together. But at the same time, then you could show them a picture and they could immediately see complex patterns that actually exist in the picture that you just don't normally even pick up on.
Yeah.
Like I'll notice that on psychedelics, I can always see where people have vacuumed the floor. Like you can see like footprints on carpet on psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you can pick up incredible details, and it's partly because so much of what we think of as our conscious perception is just our brain filling in low resolution versions of everything in our environment, because we don't think of it as novel. We don't think of it as new. We don't think of it as relevant. Um, and the psychedelic effect, in part, is an effect of um, producing a sense of novelty about everything, making everything into art, as I said.
Mm-hmm.
It's that it, and when I say it makes the world and it makes the entire world into art, it's that it it forces you to confront day to day stimuli in a way that makes you rethink and question reality and how existence is put together and what the meaning of that thing is and what it tells you about the world. And that's what art is supposed to do. And yeah, with psychedelics, it's just like everything. It does that with everything.
Yeah, it does. You were touching on like some ritualistic aspects that comes from like our heritage and whatnot a minute ago, and then we were talking about like the measuring contest of it all. Do you think like that measuring contest is this deep need again to like get back in touch with these ritualistic ways?
I mean, there is, so the coming of age rituals that I've seen, they're done in groups, and there is a competitive aspect to them
Mm-hmm.
in these cultures that, like, I'll never forget the one that like Sitting Bull does, because I read Sitting Bull's biography whenever I was in middle school, and it was like they did this thing where they would shove these reeds through. It was like they would shove them through the sides of your abdomen, and then you would dance so that it would cause these tears in the skin on the sides of your abdomen. And like the longer the tears are, the longer the scars will be, which is like gives you a certain amount of like street cred basically in the tribe, because
Right.
you were able to dance harder and longer. And like Sitting Bull just tore his out.
Yeah.
Like he literally just tore them out the sides of his abdomen because he was such a badass. And yeah, so you can see where, and this is an interesting thing, is that with every trial you're going to have people who do better than others. That's just
Mm-hmm.
how the world works, is people are different. And so yeah, there is, it makes sense that there would be this sort of competitiveness that comes along with that sense of needing to test oneself, because tests have results, and some people get better results than others, no matter what, no matter how you spin it.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when we're punishing ourselves with psychedelics. It's insane the amount of things that we leave buried and unaccounted for.
I would say it's proving, not punishing. In some cases, I
Yeah.
would say people feel like they deserve punishment.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the interesting thing, is that like proving oneself is an expense, and so is punishment. Punishment is
Mm.
also an expense. But punishment is about sort of like answering for something that you've done, whereas proving yourself is about answering for what you haven't done, I guess is the way I would put it.
Yeah, that's good put. It blows my mind, man. You know your stuff. You know your stuff.
I've thought about this stuff a lot, and I was really deep into it, in terms of getting involved with psychedelics, and um, I even had a few moments where I moonlit selling them, but it was really, the thing is that they they treat different people, people get treated so differently by them that you never know if someone's going to call you the next day and say that it changed their life or that it ruined their life.
Yeah.
And that kind of unpredictability and just the kind of the party atmosphere, there's this manic there's this manic beauty to being the person who can give someone such a profound experience, but it's definitely toxic in the long run for a lot of people, especially just in the unstructured environments that we've created in our night lives. Um, people, it's very easy for people to slip through the cracks, and I've seen plenty of people, because these are much more potent compounds than something like cannabis or some of the lighter recreational substances that we use. Um, and they have profound effects despite like the ones that are actually, when you can confirm the purity, which is its own beehive of an issue. uh, it, even still, there's a psychosocial toxicity that you have to take into account and prepare yourself for.
Right.
And that actually kind of feeds into what I was talking about earlier, that with the nonlinear aspect of this. So you can think of nonlinear in a few ways, but I think a very useful way is that um, psychedelics have a decompartmentalizing effect on your senses that allows for this sort of nonlinear um, pattern recognition, amplification sort of thing. But it can also amplify the recognition of patterns that you may have been suppressing regarding your own behavior, your own identity, who you are. And people can come to very, very unpleasant realizations about their lives very quickly in a very raw and vulnerable state when they take psychedelics. Um, I've always been fortunate in that I just sort of naturally, obsessively avoided. Uh, I avoided ignoring my faults and flaws, and I always kind of led an examined life. And also, I had I studied philosophy and literature before I ever even ran into psychedelics. I actually kind of got exposed to them at a rather advanced age. It wasn't until I was like 23, 22, something like that.
Right.
Um,
And you'd
Partly
already
because
gone through philosophy and stuff before this point, right?
I'd already graduated from college with a liberal arts degree.
Whew.
I had some experience with just like understanding how to approach really radical ideas about myself.
Right.
And I still had a long ways to go to get where I am now with things, but psychedelics were a lifeline,
Yeah.
without a doubt, for me. I didn't really realize it until I took them, how depressed I really was by the way I saw the world. That And it was interesting because I craved the psychedelic experience so much, even though I had no idea how much it had to offer me, about not just how I could see the world, but who I was. And this is something that I think is just so important and useful about psychedelics, and tragic that, you know, because of the way they work, that they do pose a genuine threat
Agreed.
to governments, to the powers that be, because they turn the world into art, and that's not always good. Whenever there's a lot of things you can deconstruct and pay attention to that are like, wait a second,
criticize something, right? Got to. Here, give me a half second. I realized that I left my windows open, and you can't hear it, but I know OBS can hear it. So I need to shut these windows and whatnot and grab a lighter. And then I want to talk more about the ability to how we can criticize ourselves and recognize these like toxic patterns, right? So give me half a second.
Yeah.
And if you need to like use the bathroom or something, now's the time.
All right.
I know, super professional.
All right.
It's all good though. So like, what was some of the experiences, like some patterns you noticed in yourself after taking psychedelics that you were like, okay, this has got to stop?
Well, so honestly, what the patterns that I saw when I took psychedelics weren't patterns that had to stop. They were patterns that I didn't want to stop. They were, and this is the thing. This is the thing I was going to get at before you had to deal with the windows, which I can appreciate. But
Rookie
is
mistakes.
that these these drugs that we take, um, all of the major recreational substances, they they give us a window into other possible versions of ourselves, right?
Yeah.
They Another way of putting it is that they transform our personalities.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there is some validity to someone arguing, well, oh well, gosh, like that wasn't me last night. I was really drunk, and it's like, well, it's true. That isn't the you that's talking to me now. It's the same pattern with the same potential within it. But obviously that potential was being unlocked by the copious amounts of ethanol that you would consume the night before.
Exactly. That's why people gain
Um,
confidence, you know?
yeah, and so I took psychedelics, and suddenly the world was so much more beautiful and interesting. And I don't know, I at that point in my life, I had just got graduated college, and I'd really gotten into the party scene in my last year. Um, I was an alcoholic, and after I took psychedelics, it was just like, um, I don't know, music had suddenly had so much more meaning to me. It was like this entire universe of meaning opening up before me, and I'd really appreciated music before, but it was like, obviously at just a whole new level of like just transformation,
Yes.
and just the intensity of experience that came from how expanded my consciousness was, how novel I was approaching everything. Like it's like the music, it was just, I was completely immersed in it.
Right. You ever
And
notice smaller details too, like things you didn't notice before in music? Like it becomes a whole new song.
oh yeah, no, like you can listen to, like I remember the one time I was listening to Drux, the Aphex Twin album,
Yep.
which is a classic, very challenging, weird album. Not as inaccessible as some of Aphex Twin stuff, but still pretty inaccessible in some ways. And I listened to the whole thing back to back, um, under the influence, and yeah, it was a profound experience. And it's interesting though, because at the same time it's like, how much of that is an illusion and how much of that is genuine. And I think part of that is, what do you go and do with that sense of profundity? That's really, like, honestly, it's almost like you are, it's what you do after you've taken the psychedelics that determines how much of that importance was an illusion. Like how you
Right.
carry on with what you learned in your life. And I became obsessed with trying to emulate that state, emulate that sense of um, profound consideration for things, and decompartmentalizing my perceptions and expanding my consciousness of the world around me. And that actually ended up driving me into the study of the sciences and pharmacology and neuroscience and cognition, and so that now I can sit here and talk about all different sorts of aspects of this to you. I think, as far as something that I did recognize that really hit me whenever I was on psychedelics, I think it was partly my social anxiety. Because at that point I was still depending on alcohol to let loose, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I didn't need alcohol to let loose when I was on psychedelics. I'm one of those people that becomes much more extroverted and expressive, and like I'll never forget, there was this one time I was at a convention and I was tripping out, and this guy who was running out, who had checked out the room that we were using, he was like this party, he was a party organizer guy, and so he'd brought these laser lights and black lights for our hotel room that he had set up, and tons of booze and all this stuff. So he had like the perfect party thing. It's just that him and none of the other people in the hotel room really were people who could really sell it. And so he tasked me with it. And of course, I was already on something at that point, and I was like, I'm going to get this party shut down. I want to get a party so big that it's going to get shut down. And so, like, I remember I found this dude who was out with this boom box at the side of the hotel because it was at a convention. And there was a bunch of people dancing around. The guy looked absolutely nuts. He just looked like he stepped off out of right out of a Green Day concert or something, you know, just sweaty hair and like these like eyeliner and like just everything. And I was just like, dude, you've got to go up to this room. We've got booze, we've got black lights, we've got lasers, and like it was, and so I did that, and then I'm going around and I'm telling all these people about it. I remember I walked up and there was like this lounge full of beautiful college girls. They were just all sitting around, and I'm like, ladies, what are you just doing sitting around? And they're like, oh, we heard there's this convention, but like they won't let us in and we have to like pay. I was like, forget the convention, you should come up to this room. and like I managed to get all of these girls to come up.
Yeah.
I managed to get like, and by the time I got up there, you know, it's absolute mayhem. And I kind of like set up beforehand to like put my backpack in an area and cover it up with my jacket so that it would just kind of be in the background and nobody would mess with it, because I knew it was just going to get insane. And yeah, like I remember I got up there, and then like as I got up there, everybody's partying and stuff, and suddenly you start to hear this booming coming from the hallway, and the guy from the side of the street with the giant boom box comes in, and apparently he'd gotten shut down at the street, and so he came up to our place, and yeah, so anyway, that was, I'm getting way too far into that story.
Still, the point was the confidence it gave you to start the party. Yeah,
like, and the cops came and shut down the party, and it wasn't like the end of the world because nobody got burned or anything, but it was one of those things where I was like, you know what, screw it, let's see what I can do. Like, these people just, like, you know, I kind of almost wanted to make it something where it's like they didn't know what they were signing up for when they made me the person that was going to get people to this party, because literally nobody knew about it. It was just like me and a bunch of like people who work in tech, and one of them likes organizing parties, and so he had the cool stuff. I just needed to tell people about it,
right?
And yeah, it's so fascinating the way that psychedelics can change how you relate socially with other people,
right?
Including influencing other people in ways that they'll behave in ways that you would never expect them to behave normally.
Right.
Like I don't, and this might just be just how compelling I become whenever I'm on these things.
Mm-hmm.
But there'll be times where I'll take some psychedelics and then like a plan will fall through or something. Like one time my plans fell through and I ended up at a friend's house and we stayed up till like 6 in the morning and they weren't on anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no reason that they would normally stay up till 6 in the morning, but they were
Yeah.
staying up with me, and the way that, I don't know about you, but like the way pets, especially cats, will respond to you when you're on
They
this,
know.
like they
know.
freaking know. When like you're like you can just feel your skin is secreting something else. Like I called it trip juice. Because it's just like it's just like you become this this secretory creature in a way, and I think that that's partly what the cats are picking up on. But they really can sense that something special is going on.
Right. What brings some supernatural wonders into it all, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I remember one time I was settling down to just kind of like calm myself. It was after a really long and crazy night at this party, and there were cats on the property. And I'm sitting up against this railing on this balcony, and I've got my eyes closed and I'm meditating, and suddenly I feel this push of a cat pushing itself against the back of my head and shoulders, and there's this cat walking back and forth and brushing itself across me as I'm meditating, and it felt so, it's like such a profound connection. It's like the cat knows.
Every cat is a Reiki master.
I've had similar experiences with equine creatures too, horses and donkeys.
Oh, whoa.
They'll respond differently to you.
Yeah, they kind of see through you for a minute.
They're not scared at all. Like I've had horses be very skittish with me normally, but like there's this childlike quality to the way you are on these things. Because I think a lot of what psychedelics do is they emulate a childlike state of exploration
absolutely.
and novelty.
Right.
Because children do the same thing. Their brains go crazy whenever they run into anything. Like, that's why, I mean, I'm sure you can remember when you were a kid watching what are now, you know, maybe not boring cartoons, but they're just like two-dimensional cartoons. But when you're watching them as a kid, it's just like
that's
another
your reality.
Yeah.
You're in the cartoon.
No, when also you just don't, when you're a kid, you don't have nearly such a defined and intricate sense of self that gets in the way of that immersion.
Yeah, unbiased rationality. I get you.
Well, because it's like, you know, kids, it's amazing what they'll put up with because that's all they've done. You know, like when you're an adult, at that point, generally, if you've matured, you've learned how to put your foot down, how to shop around for things, how to refuse and set up boundaries. When you're a child, you don't really have that normally. And yeah, like putting up with school and all that, like I wouldn't put up with the BS I put up with in middle school now. But at the time, it's just like that was life. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, I don't really have any other choice. I was a pretty obedient kid too. I know there's kids out there who are just like, well, screw that, I'm just leaving school. Good for them.
Whoops.
Maybe good for them. I don't know. School has I can't say that I've found it to be improving lately, but back to psychedelics.
Right.
So,
what about empathy? Like the amount of empathy, like, because it does open all these pathways in our brain. We start to communicate more with ourselves in really odd ways. But like we were talking about, the way people and animals, they can all sense it, and there's this confidence in everything. Do you think it's the level of empathy that everything around us can sense that as well, and that's what opens the door
So again, I would say that empathy is a process of decompartmentalization, right?
Right.
And psychedelics enhance all decompartmentalize decompart. I'm trying to think about what the adjective form of that would be. All decompartmentalizing processes.
Right.
And yeah, it's very easy for at least your perception of someone's emotional experience to kind of mix with your own.
Right.
And people do sense that. Uh, they sense that oneness with reality as well, which extends into this sort of entheogenic realm where you're connecting more with other people than you normally do. At the same time, I would say that I'd say that's more true with mushrooms than with some of the synthetic psychedelics like the 2Cs and LSD. Although you can still get those with that, I would say that in some ways people can become uh, even maybe they can be more sympathetic without becoming more empathetic. That they can like that happened to me before where I could see somebody else's point of view more but still avoid being as emotionally impacted by it.
Right.
Depending on what phase of the experience I'm in. Like sometimes there'll be like, you're peaking and then you're just like really in it. And like if somebody comes up to you and they're having a bad time, then you're there with them.
Yup.
Um,
Yup. That's happened
and
a
then
few
there's
times
times
to me.
where it's like you've come over the peak, you're starting to go back down the mountain, and you're kind of more of a mastery of yourself, especially if you have experience with this sort of state.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and at that point, I did find that there's times where I could actually suppress that to some degree, but but yeah, regardless, it's definitely it tremendously accelerates your ability to learn about yourself because it pushes you. It's basically like a stress test of your identity, of your personality. Um, it forces you to kind of like echolocate the boundaries of what you're capable of in some ways.
Right.
Because you can't really do that in day-to-day life and existence. And there's other ways to do it, but they're very inconvenient in our modern fast-paced era. Because like I've gone on a 10-day meditation retreat before, which is like, around 10 hours of meditation, no
Whew.
reading material, no exercise, no talking, no eye contact, no music for 10 days. And that gets you to a similar state.
Yeah, I was just about to ask that. Yeah.
Yeah, I found that it was pretty, by the end of it, you have that similar sense, especially since, you're not using your eyes nearly as much. It was interesting. It was like my consciousness wasn't really concentrated in my face anymore. I was
Right.
able, because I was doing a body scan
Mm-hmm.
meditation, it was Vipassana meditation.
Yep. I've heard of it.
Yeah, it's basically like a really detailed body scan meditation.
Yeah.
Um, and mainly with the idea of grasping the impermanence of existence in order to be able to better cope with the highs and lows of our cravings
Right.
and our repulsions with the world around us.
The little death,
Um,
right?
yeah, and yeah, there was a similar experience there, although it didn't have the thrownness, to use Heidegger's term of psychedelics. And when I say thrownness, for anyone in the audience who is unfamiliar, what I mean is the way Heidegger described it was thrownness is this sense of being thrown into life, where it, like I was saying, it's not something you sign up for. You're just there, and things are
Yeah.
happening, and you're in it. You're falling through it. You're falling through time and space, and you're here, and you've got to deal with
Let
it.
go.
And there is, I've often compared it in some ways to surfing, in that there's like this profound power that you're caught up in, and you can either try to gracefully go where the power is taking you, or you can let your nerves and your anxieties and your fears get the better of you,
Whoa.
and then you're just tossed and turning, and you don't know
Taken
which
into the
way's up and which
undertow.
way's down. Yeah.
Man, now that's exactly what it's like. That's exactly what it's like. I felt myself walking on the edge of falling into the tides, and then being
Yeah.
able to be like, okay,
What's That's
and
the
just
thing, is
let
like you
go, and
can.
then the visuals take over, and you just go with it. Go with the visuals. Embrace the colors.
Yeah, well, and then just embrace the energy and
Hmm.
embrace what it's making you feel. And yeah, like it's amazing though how thrillingly tenuous it can feel. Like that you can sense that there's this profound power to the experience, that you're just being you're just sort of like surfing on the top of. Like, it's the best way to describe it. Like, there's this huge wave of psychic energy underneath you, and you're riding it, and it's been unlocked in you, and you can't put it back in the box. Here it is.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've had some very uncomfortable experiences with that, but sometimes what I'll call them is final bosses. Because drug final bosses is when you have the bad trip starting to creep up on you, and you have
Yep.
to deal with it. You have to cope with it. You have to turn it into a positive experience.
Yeah.
And and just like with a final boss in a video game, that comes down to, what have you learned about the game so far? What tools have you collected along the way? Um, and how well can you suppress your nerves and your flaws and your shortcomings, and work with what you have dynamically in the moment to create a positive outcome? And
Yeah.
there's been times where I've done that well. There's been times when I've done it poorly. I think I've managed to do it every time in a way that, except one. There was one time that was very bad, but that was for other reasons. Let's just say that the substance was not as advertised
Oh
in
no.
that case,
Got an
and it was a
experimental.
very, very unfortunate. Um, I actually think it was purposeful. I think that I was purposely given something wrong to teach me a lesson, which it did. Um, but but yeah, it can be profoundly rewarding to be challenged like that in the midst of such a powerful experience and come out on top. It really, there's no feeling like it.
Yeah. Do you think that that feeling's similar to what like mystics talk about enlightenment?
I think it's similar to what the shamans talk about when they discuss traveling to the underworld.
Mm-hmm.
So there's
Yeah.
kind of like the proving rites of the shaman is to go and commune with the dead.
Yeah.
Um, and, and I would say that that's kind of, there is often this feeling of the nearness of death, I found, with the particularly dark um, trips that I had to kind of like get back out of, or renew myself within the midst of. Kind of like a phoenix almost is sort of
Yeah.
part of it. Is
Absolutely.
you have to let yourself burst into flames so that you can rise from the ashes. If you
Yeah.
try to hang on too hard, then you're just going to burn.
Yeah. It killed the narcissist in me. Like I used to have some narcissistic qualities, and after I started taking psychedelics on a regular basis, it just vanished. It was like, this is not the place for me, and wandered off. And there was not much fight to it. And it was so weird that the psychedelics allowed me, and this is why I brought up criticism of the self earlier, is because it allowed me to be so prudent. It allowed me to be like, okay, you did this, this, and this out of a selfish act. Now, how did that benefit you? And how have those bridges you've now burned ever going to be mended? How are you going to heal this? And just this constant process. And you do have to sit with it. You have to face the worst parts of yourself. And you can either fight it, like you were talking about with the wave earlier, or you can accept that your subconscious is trying to show you how you can fix yourself. And there's a level of self-love that's healthy, and then there's a level that is selfish, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and right now in modern society, more than ever, we're being faced with all of these strange reflections of ourself in, you know, these dark mirrors that we have in our life.
Yeah.
Seeing ourselves through a lens darkly, and yeah, narcissism is around every corner. Histrionics are at the door. Antisocial behavior is at one's beck and call. You know, you have all of these other faceless representations of other people that you can just attack at a whim on Twitter. You can be constantly obsessing over your likes on Instagram. It's a world that's, you know, we have this constellation that's made for us, all around each of us at this point. And so easy to just let it kind of put you to sleep and just accept that this is really who you are and it's okay. And yeah, it's not just who you are. You can be all sorts of things. And if you stress yourself out enough, you'll learn that. And that is part of what psychedelics do, is they're profoundly stressful. You know, I mean, like if you want to look at why plants make psychedelics, fundamentally, it's because, like, it's so funny, you know, because I looked into it and I was like, well, why do they make psychedelics really? It's like, well, it's because they don't want animals eating them. and you'd think, well, why don't they just make poisons then, if they don't want animals eating them? But if you make a poison and then the animal eats the poison and dies, well, now another animal is going to come along that doesn't have any sort of lesson that it's learned, and now it's going to eat you again, and then but eventually all the animals that when they eat you and they die, they're all going to be dead, and then the only animals left are the ones that can eat you without dying, because there's going to be animals that have figured out how to process your poisons. And so it kind of makes sense that what you would have instead is, it's like, well, so when I make this chemical, the animal trips the fuck out and completely rethinks its life. Right?
It loses its appetite entirely.
And this is the really interesting thing about the research surrounding addiction and psychedelics, is that, and it's so mind-blowing when you think about it, that plants use psychedelics to change the behavior of the animals that try to eat them. Fundamentally, what psychedelics are doing is trying to hack into. That's why there's this whole new field of chemicals that we've invented called psychoplastogens, which are psychedelics that cause. Yeah, you should look it up. It's psychedelics that cause profound increases in neuroplasticity in the brain. Which includes all of the classical psychedelics. Oh
my God.
And yeah, like that was what Bill W., the guy who wrote the big book for Alcoholics Anonymous, he got ostracized. It basically ruined his life whenever he started pushing for the use of psychedelic therapy to treat alcoholism.
Yeah.
And because of how profound the results were for him, and how profound the results were that he'd found for other people. And yeah, like there was like a 50% chance of like a multi-month recession of cigarette addiction in people who use cigarettes in like one of the first studies they ever conducted with LSD. And it makes sense because it's the plants didn't want you to eat them.
Yeah.
And it's like,
true.
It's so beautiful. And the thing is that people act like that's reducing it, like that's reductive. Like, oh, you're making it sound like psychedelics aren't that amazing. It's like, no, it's like that is so cool that like
Yeah,
this is how the world works. We have these really simple drives that build up with these other complex parts of reality into this
right,
amazing thing. The same way that a tiny seed can grow into a towering tree.
right.
You know, it's the story of life. And yes, with psychedelics too, you this tiny little amount of a substance, you know, less than you can normally measure without like putting it in a solution and soaking a blotter paper in it, and it can cause these profound transformations of consciousness that
Right.
change who you think you are, change where you think you are, you know.
Definitely.
I mean, I took psychedelics and suddenly it's like I am in a massive, sprawling, fascinating universe full of infinite detail. And before that, I was just like a college student who felt like the economy wasn't doing so good and that I couldn't get a good job and I was just kind of bummed and um you know, it was just like suddenly there were just so many other things to appreciate. It's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of existential crises, I'm gonna grab a beverage. My fridge is right behind me, though.
All right.
I think when I started to have that existential crisis, because it's not a bad one. When you hear the word the existential crisis, a lot of people associate it with like probably one of the worst experiences they've had in life. But I think that when you experience an existential crisis under psychedelics, it has the exact opposite effect as to someone that goes into psychosis and breaks down. I think it's like looking into the stars and seeing like, wow, I'm dust. I'm floating in space right now. And your brain is trying to cope with that, but there's this moment of surrender, back to like the wave, right? Trying to ride the wave. There's this moment of surrender and deep breath where you're like, ah, stars, I'm so small, you're so pretty. And it's so subtle and it's so beautiful. And there's very few words that can describe the experience I'm trying to express here, but there is this awe-like wonder that washes over you, and you can feel divinity within view, within arm's reach, right there.
Yeah, awe. That's pretty much the word for it. The
Yeah,
only one.
yeah.
And you know, when something's awesome, right?
Awesome, bro.
Awesome. Um, yeah, there's actually like an entire literature on awe. I haven't plumbed the depths too much of it, but from what I understand, fundamentally, it's again, it comes back to that nonlinear thing
Yeah,
that awe is this nonlinear experience of um, in indefinitely voluminous meaning
yeah,
that you're noticing it on a subconscious level because we perceive meaning on a subconscious level. That's how attention works. Is you know we notice something and then we notice that it's novel, and then you start looking at it, and the moment you're able to start making any connections between it and something else that you've experienced or in the world around it, it'll start to interest you until you start losing any more connections and any more like new thoughts and insights about
right.
how to predict the world around you. That's fundamentally
Yeah,
what it's about. And yeah, like you go to the Grand Canyon and you look at it and you just want to stare at it. You just want to
yeah.
be like,
It takes you away.
and and you know, in the moment it's just like wow, but then you can go back and say this explains so much about geology, about what the how old the earth is, like where we are, like what is going on. Like it's very clear from looking at this that obviously this wasn't built a few days before I was born, right? Like This isn't something that human beings did. This is something done by forces greater than myself over a scale of time that is clearly far beyond anything that my life can sum up to.
Yeah.
As a single life. Now, that's the thing too, is that we also, I think, get in some ways a profound sense of the fact that we ourselves are we're part of this process that made the Grand Canyon.
Right.
We're part of the process that made the sun. That really, if you believe in the Big Bang, that all of the molecules that make up us, that make up the sun, that make up the stars, were all together at one point. That we're all in this together, in this really wow way that you can kind of sense when you're particularly elevated.
I know exactly what
People
you're talking
sense
about.
it. It's that connection to the universe, that sense of agelessness and infinity.
Oneness, you know.
Yeah, yeah, and one just that it's like that I'm at the cusp of a 13 billion year wave
Oh
of
God, yeah.
patterns that have been spiraling out into existence this whole time.
Right. I think what we're talking about right here, the first principle in Hermetics and like the Kabbalion is a mentalism. Have you heard of it before? I'm just curious.
I haven't. No, I haven't looked into
So
hermetics very much.
it's basically mentalism, like as above, so below, right? So
Hmm.
our consciousness becomes reality, and vice versa. Reality becomes our consciousness. And
So
so,
hermetics, you mean Hermes Trismegistus? Is
yes,
that?
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. So it's one of the seven principles, but mentalism is just the dictate that thought is reality, you know. And it's so important because like why this matters is because when you are on these substances, you truly realize how powerful your thoughts are and how much you have an impact on everything around you because of this oneness again. And everything is, you know, a reflection of itself in some way. I've seen it said somewhere before, but we're all God playing different characters. It's really
Yeah. Alan
fascinating.
Watts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that was Alan Watts. Okay. Thank you.
He. That. I feel like that's pretty much at the core of everything that Watts is to talk about. Like it
Yeah.
always ends up coming back up. Um.
It's real
And
shit.
yeah, it's it's definitely interesting. It's yeah, we're getting a little outside of psychedelics in
But
and
this
of
is,
themselves, but
but
that's what psychedelics do, though. They
exactly.
decompartmentalize, right? Like we're of course the conversation is going to decompartmentalize, and yeah, Alan Watts, he's definitely an interesting figure, and his take on that we are all God pretending to be us. I I sense a truth in it. I would also argue that I I find the idea that we're made in the image of God in some ways
Hmm.
just as potent and useful,
Yep.
maybe more so,
I agree.
because I do not think that we are God actually.
Mm.
Um, I suppose what I would say, I mean, there's a part of us that's God, I guess.
Yeah.
It's the part that we don't really, the part that we're beholden to.
Right.
Um, the part that the part. So this is how I always start whenever I'm trying to define, because I have my own intellectual. I'm an
Hey,
intellectual. I have
have
my own
at it, man.
definition of God.
I'm enjoying this.
Um, I believe that the best way I've found to start defining God, because it takes a while, is that
Forever.
God is that which you ignore at your peril. That you can always find
I
out.
gotta write that down.
You can always find where God is in something by what it is that if you ignore it, if you set it aside, if you procrastinate to address it, it will incur a debt to reality, to the universe, to
Yeah.
God. I mean, that's
Yeah.
the thing is like you'll hear atheists talk about reality, about the laws of physics, about probability and statistics, and it's like there's all these different ways of talking about this thing that they don't want to use the word. I can't use I don't want to use the word God because it's too controversial.
Yeah.
But it's only been controversial in these recent years post Enlightenment. There was nothing controversial about the fact that obviously there is a transcendent order that we must either subjugate ourselves to for our own betterment or fight futilely.
Right. I agree.
That there's no other options.
Absolutely.
You can try to play God, and good luck with that.
I was just about to say that. Good luck.
Yeah.
I think one way I heard a good way to explain God was I don't know if he's the original person that said it, but it's the person I heard say it. Damien Nichols said that God is the word represents generate, order, destroy, and it fits perfectly for the way we need to encapsulate it.
Yeah, I like that. That's a nice trifecta of
It works.
characteristics.
It works.
Yeah.
I wanted to backtrack to like the oneness we were talking about, though, right? Also, the Bill Hicks, he's his famous bit about the weatherman, right? But at the end of it, it talks about vibrations, right? And that we are all one vibration. And I didn't understand that until I started getting into like physics. And like at a certain point in physics, you understand that everything is purely sound. It's a vibration at some point, at its most minute level. And when you realize that we're all just vibrations and we're all vibrating out it off of each other, it blows your mind. It's more than just stardust. It's realizing that these are sound waves interacting with one another that are deeply embedded with another.
Say waves. I mean, sound waves are a bit of a different thing, but
Right, right.
it's all oscillatory. That
Yeah,
we're all resonances of different wave patterns and excitations of these overlapping. If you're familiar with field theory, of these different overlapping fields that expand three-dimensionally throughout existence. Um, yeah, and you can definitely sense that on psychedelics, this idea, and when you're meditating and all these different things, this idea of um, a resonance and of waveforms sort of uniting everything. Um, yeah, so what would you say, how would you say you've applied this concept?
I think it taught me how, one, because backtracking again to like mentalism, right? How powerful everything I think is and how much that impacts my life, because I didn't realize it. You know what I mean? I didn't realize my thoughts were my own to a certain extent, and that everyone else is going to experience what I experience to some extent because they're in my life. So whatever I project to others in my life is so important, that whatever exchange of energy I'm doing in life is going to impact my life. So when I realized how powerful my thoughts were without even exerting them, I was able to be more mindful. So it taught me mindfulness and to be less reactionary, and a lot about stoicism.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember it was Jung, I think, who called human beings uh, diffuse patterns, is what he called them, which is patterns where you can change out the parts that are used to make the patterns without the pattern itself breaking down. That as long as
Right.
the parts that are needed are the same. Um, because so to go back even further. So when I was younger, I kind of came to this clever cope with death, that in a way we are in the land of the dead because everything we eat to create our bodies and our minds and everything is dead. That in a way we're an agglomeration of particles from other dead things.
Mm-hmm.
It was an interesting thought experiment at the time, and I managed to convince a few people that I think it helped some people with their depression in a moment at least. But ultimately, I found that it wasn't true. That really, it isn't the particles that are me. It's the pattern of the particles. That
Whoa.
you could replace all the atoms in my body with the same atom, and I would be me.
Yeah.
That it's whenever that pattern ends that I end. That it's not these particles that make me up. It's not like when these particles spread off into the universe that I spread off into the universe. Same way that I don't feel the skin that's constantly flaking off my body and producing, like, what is it, like 80% of the dust in your house is your own skin.
It's a lot. Almost all of it.
And I don't feel that dust as me in that way. Now, again, though, human beings are patterns, and so that means that so there's, and this is interesting too, because there's like different layers to this. So you've got your genetic pattern, which is this sort of very, very, very compressed sort of information, right? Like compressing information on a disk. Like you take the simplest possible indicator you can in order to be able to trace the breadcrumb back to the overall complexity of the original thing. Same thing happens with our genes. But then on a much more expansive level, you could also say that, because if you think of your entity, yourself, as stopping at the edge of whatever parts of you share the same DNA, right? So it's like, at the edge of my skin, this is where we're all the same pattern inside. We all have the same molecule in every single one of these little trillions of cells that make up my body. But again, it's like you could just replace all the atoms in those cells and in the DNA, and as long as it's the same pattern, it's fine. So really, it's the pattern that matters, and the pattern of me doesn't end at my DNA.
Yeah.
It extends out. That right now, like I put everything in this room together pretty much. Like, it's been manufactured in different places, but I brought it all here. I made it look the way it does. I've arranged it as it is, and it's all because of me. And so, in a way, it's an extension of me.
Yeah.
And this is the crazy part, though, is you don't just rearrange objects in your bedroom or in your house or where you work. You could think of those as these little tendrils of yourself that have spread into the world, but you rearrange the neural connections in the other people's heads. You implant thoughts, you implant ideas, you leave an impression, and that impression is you.
Yeah.
Like, if you define yourself as the pattern of you, when that pattern imprints another pattern, that has entangled you with that thing, that has made it a part of you. I was talking with a friend the other night about this, because she was dealing with some difficult problems in her life lately, and her grandmother died recently, and she was asking herself what she was going to do, and she said she immediately heard her grandmother give her advice the same way that she would if she'd been alive. And I told her, I was like, that's your grandmother.
Yeah.
Like, really, like, not just like, oh, that's your memory of your grandmother. Isn't that sweet? I'm sure she's smiling from heaven. And no, like, that, if you think of human beings as what they really are, which are these patterns, this is where, and they're patterns that reproduce themselves in the world around them. And I think that's what we get to when we talk about being made in the image of God.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that that we are kind of these patterned node, these nodes of pattern within existence from which impressions can be made on the world.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's like that's your grandmother, like literally in your head. Like, this is the thing, is it's wild. It's like when you're talking about these patterns, it's like who you are becomes mixed up with the world around you to some degree.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
it's somewhat of a chaotic way to think about it, but it can be very insightful. Um, and yes, psychedelics definitely helped me become the person who could ever recognize that,
Yeah,
because
same.
it's just very easy, when you're born and everything, to just kind of be like, well, I got my meat and everything beyond that is something else, right?
Right.
So
What you're getting into is because how one of the ways I discovered how to describe these things about the experience that psychedelics evoke is the excuse me, the philosopher's stone in alchemy, specifically the Jungian description is very accurate, and I feel like psychedelics, they literally put you through the synthesis process. It literally forces you through understanding your own dichotomy.
yeah, well, because with the Hegelian process, you're talking about thesis and antithesis,
Yeah,
and of course, you oftentimes, what we do out of convenience is we erect a barrier between the theses and the antithesis and antitheses that we recognize in our heads. And again, this get back, so it's funny, it always comes back to this, is that psychedelics break down those barriers. It
yeah,
just, like, it pulls out the slat, and suddenly it's like, well,
yeah.
we like it's time for either a synthesis or absolute chaos, like, or both.
Exactly, exactly.
So
That's that, but like I said, like I think they could implement like the process of the philosopher's stone into understanding the way psychedelics work. I think it would really help because when you're talking about spiritual synthesis specifically, there's the ego death, and then there's unity, and then there's ebb and flow, and then there's the great work. You were just talking about how you were trying to help your friend understand that is your grandmother. Well, that memory is, yes, her grandmother, because her grandmother completed the great work, the magnum opus. She will forever be remembered in the hearts and minds of those who love her. That is the fountain of youth. That is eternity. That is immortality to a certain extent.
yeah, I can appreciate that. It's interesting. It does always end up coming up with psychedelic experiences, mortality, the
Yeah.
end, and infinity. There's definitely uh, the human brain is obviously evolved to ignore the sense of infinity in most respects, because I,
It can't
I work as a
understand it.
math tutor. I work as a math tutor, and yeah, it's definitely something that a lot of students have trouble with. I didn't, but when I was a kid, I got really obsessed with the idea of infinity. Like, I remember I would, like, think up all these wild thought experiments, like what would it be like if you had just like a rod of metal that was like a just sticking through the whole universe like a toothpick, just like this infinitely long rod of metal going either direction. And when you think about it, it's like it would take an infinite amount of force to change the direction that the rod is positioned, because the rod is infinite mass, right? So the
Yeah.
only way you can actually change or move the rod at all would be to cut it somewhere and start bending it, because it just isn't going to move because it has infinite inertia. And yeah, I was messing around with those ideas when I was a kid, so I don't know. I guess there is definitely, and maybe it's partly, I say that we're not evolved for it, but maybe partly it's just all the light pollution clouding our night skies.
It's a damn
these
shame.
days
It's a damn shame.
that keeps us from, it keeps us on earthly concerns.
Right.
Um,
Another solution is just walk out in the grass barefoot. Close your eyes and look down instead of up. You know, ain't got no stars. Appreciate your senses. Our nerves,
yeah,
they're stars, they're lightning, they're electricity. There's so much we can appreciate. It's all around us. Any way we want to see divinity, so to speak, you know, we can find it if we want to.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
like you were saying earlier, ignore it at your own peril.
Yes, yes. And the thing is, because yeah, you were talking earlier about the stars as sort of um, this foil to ourselves that shows us how insignificant we can be.
Yeah.
I never got that sense. Because for
Well,
one thing, when you look at a star, yes, it's very large, but it's a relatively simple process compared to a human being.
yeah.
That if you judge me and our sun in terms of complexity, I mean, yes, there's a bunch of random movements and eddies and flows of particles in the sun that are very complex in the way that random things are complex.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of a complexity of an ordered system, um, the star is just kind of smashing itself together in a giant thermonuclear furnace thing
Yep.
going on. I'm not doing that. There's a lot of very, very complicated transformations going on inside of me all the time. I mean, over the process of this discussion that we've been having, literally hundreds of different genes have been turned on and off. Proteins are getting made. They're getting involved in changing the way that we're going to communicate and think from now on, how we're going to store information. And that's just going on inside of our heads.
Yeah.
We've also got, just the rest of our bodies. And that's the other thing for psychedelics is the consciousness expansion.
Yep.
So what we're talking about right now, the knowledge of these things is consciousness expansion. Like fundamentally, like I'm aware of like the CMOS sensor inside of the camera lens that I'm looking at right now. And that's why I have these studio lights on so that I can make myself look clear and have a good picture for this podcast. But also there's ways that this helps me on a psychological level dealing with my own mind, that I learned from psychedelics, which is that, there's 86 billion neurons in my head on average. That's like the most recent estimate. And not all of them, honestly, only about like 30% of them probably are involved in like your cortex and all of that, where you're really making decisions. Regardless, though, it's obvious that, of course, I'm not going to be of unified mind on the decisions I'm going to make every time. That, of course, I'm going to disagree with myself. Of course, when I take drugs or don't get enough sleep, I'm going to become a different person. Of course, because I'm not one thing. I'm one person, but a person isn't one thing. I'm really trillions of little entities that have evolved over time to grow together, become together, and look out for each other. And that, in a way, I'm this synthesis of a simpler form of life that's learned to operate at a new layer of existence, a new layer of analysis and reality, the mesoscopic layer, as we call it. You've got the microscopic, the macroscopic, and then the mesoscopic. And yeah, in a lot of ways, it does seem like we're kind of sandwiched in the middle in terms of scale in the universe.
Yeah.
And which is why it makes sense that I would be so much more complicated than that star. Is because if you just look at, so this is the thing too, because people talk about like if if a flea was 200 times bigger than it actually is, its own legs would break when it jumps. And it's like, why? Well, it's because atoms don't get bigger. So like the materials that make up the flea stay the same no matter how big which is why like Honey I Shrunk the Kids always I was always like, how does that work? Is it like, so okay, the collagen in my skin is made up of a chain of molecules. Do I replace every other molecule in the chain to make it smaller? And then what happens to my skin? What happens to my hair? Like, how does my hair get that small? Like, how do I? It just none of it. It's not science. It's just magic, really. That movie is a fantasy movie, not a science fiction movie. Um, and yeah, like understanding that sort of complexity and embracing it makes my world so much simpler because I'm not flabbergasted by disagreeing with myself, by not feeling of a unified mind about everything that I run into in the world. It doesn't confuse me. It makes complete sense, which in a way simplifies my life. And this is something that I learned a lot in math, is that you can embrace complexity in a way that makes life much simpler, simply by recognizing and accepting the complexity for what it is. And that oftentimes it's sort of like you'll have this difficult sort of crucible of confusion that you have to struggle through, which is the classic psychedelic narrative, right? Is that you come to this, you're coming up, you feel uncomfortable, you reach this climax of madness, and then if everything's going right, if you're in the right place and the right state of mind, you'll have this crystallization of all of these different things that have been floating around in your mind for like whatever amount of time it's been since you last had such a experience. And then you can come back down sort of like reintegrated, it's sort of that, it's the Phoenician concepts of, disintegration and reintegration. And also it's also the Christ narrative of dying and being reborn, and that you have the self that's able to persist through all that.
The Phoenix.
But yes.
Yep.
So yeah, that was a very big one for me. Was
same.
I need to be expanding my consciousness, because when I took psychedelics for the first time, it was just like the sheer volume of things I had been ignoring astounded me, and it delighted me because so many of them were so wonderful and fascinating, and yeah, I never wanted that to go away. And it did. I mean, I had that wonderful coming to God experience on psychedelics, and everything was great. I was convinced I was going to be super positive, awesome guy for the rest of my life. I had it figured out, and then I ended up becoming a deadbeat alcoholic again, and I ended up going to jail and all this other stuff, and yeah, it's funny. You can get this false sense from them too. It's definitely, there's definitely an aspect of psychedelics where they can lead to delusion.
Yeah, I actually, that's where I want to go with this before we close up shop. I wanted to go over some of the dangers that we've both kind of encountered along the journey of psychedelics. That way some people can take away from that and kind of like look out for some red flags in their own experiences.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, being sloppy. So there's one thing that I've just learned from drugs in general, is sometimes the stupidest decisions you make are not when you're high. They're when you want to get high.
Yeah.
The ones that have changed my life for the worse have always been decisions that I was making whenever I wanted to get my hands on the drug. And that can make you make stupid decisions about who you're trusting, where you are, when you are. So what I always tell people, set and setting, doing your homework. When you've done it right, when you've set things up so that you have a wonderful experience laid out for yourself ahead of time, I don't know that there's anyone in the world that you can feel more gratitude to, really. Like, because in the moment, you're so vulnerable whenever you take the psychedelic, and that to know that you've done the work to give yourself what will be a life-changing experience for the better is profoundly rewarding for both sober you and tripping you and everyone before and after in between.
Yeah.
So the classic term for it is set and setting. Pay attention to your set and setting, to where you are mentally, where you are physically, in terms of your health. Like I highly recommend trying to get good sleep beforehand, and yeah, like have a plan, like set something up for yourself, and maybe you're looking for a more spontaneous sort of trip, but regardless, I would recommend take some vitamin C beforehand. Vitamin C is very good to take before you trip. It helps with some of the vasoconstriction and some of the other physical side effects.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you get sloppy about that and you take them at the wrong time, you can have a very negative formative experience. You can kind of break yourself, and a lot of people, again, it's like, obviously it's nothing you can ever fully describe to people when you talk about psychedelics, because a lot of people just think, oh, I'm gonna like see dragons and crazy patterns and shit. It's gonna look all weird. And it's like, well, no, it doesn't just look weird. It feels weird. It thinks weird. It like
Smells weird.
everything
Hears
is
weird.
worse. Like there's no, like, your entire thought process, your perceptions, everything is laced with this novelty, this profoundness, and yeah, it's something that you need to prepare for and respect. So
Yeah.
that's like one of my key adages is you respect your drugs and they respect you back.
Right.
That these are in a way sacraments, that we use to change ourselves, to work, to change our personalities, to develop as psychosocial beings, and yeah, you can really produce a negative development if you're not careful. Now, there are ways to prevent that. One thing I would say is, before you take psychedelics, read up on philosophy. Like, examine your own life. Conduct a inventory of conscience before the day before you trip, or whenever you're going to, like, just beforehand. You always want to go through an inventory of conscience. You want to think about all the ways that you're an asshole, all the ways that you haven't lived up to your promises with other people, the things that you need to do better, the mistakes that you've made. You want to get that all on the table while you're sober, so that once you're actually tripping, it doesn't just all crash down on your head when you're not ready for it.
Yeah.
So generally, I do find that, yeah, it can be sometimes a somewhat uncomfortable process getting ready for a psychedelic experience for me, because there's the anxiety of it, but also you really should you should like just look at yourself critically, because then you're kind of done with it. Like you've gotten that out of the way. If it comes up, you've already kind of faced it. You're not. It's not something that's just going to blindside you. So there's that. Obviously, at this point in the world, it's difficult to know who to trust for sourcing of psychedelics. With that in mind, I do recommend that people try to be patient, and if they have a new source, I know not everybody has access to reagent testing and like, any other sort of analytical equipment. Take a low dose, like to take just a little bit, see if it feels the way it should. Take a little bit more. Be patient with yourself. Because again, it's like when you're sober, that's where you make the stupidest decisions, is when you're sober but on the edge of doing something, on the edge of getting somewhere. That's where you make the really, really stupid mistakes. Because, to quote carpenters, measure twice, cut once.
Absolutely. Know what you're getting.
And you can always take more. You can't take less.
Yeah. Oh. That's been my experience as well. I've always regretted taking too much instead of just like a little bit throughout the night, building it up.
Yeah, I mean, I used to really go heroic with it. Like I would start out with like 300 micrograms, and then right at the peak I'd take 500 micrograms, and it would just go on for like over 18 hours of craziness. I was really into doing that back then. I have since definitely cut back on that, especially since there were times where I did that with something that probably wasn't as advertised, and it burned me. I still managed to make it into a positive experience, but at the cost of having to delude myself, I would say, to ignore what's really going on, and in a way to kind of constrain my consciousness to this sort of shallow, manic optimism, where I'm just, whatever, maybe this is uncomfortable, maybe, but I'm just going to have a good time anyway, yay. which helps you get through it, and it's a good perspective to have, to be able to call on in the world. But yeah, at the same time, it's delusional.
Yep.
You're having to accept, like I had to accept a delusion sometimes in order to get through the experience, without having to worry about the ramifications of what's going on. Because you can cause brain damage. You can alter yourself permanently doing this stuff if you're not careful. So that's the other thing, is respect it, take it seriously. And I guess the other thing is, I mean, there's only so much harm reduction you can do with young people, because to get back to what we were getting at the very beginning of this conversation, we crave more than anything, more than the advice of our elders, more than being able to make something of ourselves in the world. A lot of people, especially intelligent people, crave this proving of the self, this challenge, this coming of age. And yeah, I've found, especially with gifted young people, that you can pretty much just tell them, well, you're going to agree with this down the line, but I know you're not going to listen to me, right?
Yeah.
Is sometimes all you can do is plant seeds and let someone make mistakes. Because if they never get to make the mistakes, they're only ever going to learn with their minds, not their body. Sometimes you literally just have to do something that's going to make your body start growing differently. That's going to in a way, damage you for the better, for the wiser. Um, it's still like, I feel like there's the best that you can do is plant the seeds so that when the forest fire comes, they'll sprout as soon as they can, instead of somebody being without anything after a real conflagration in their lives. I did that with a friend a while back, and yeah, he finally did kind of come to and realize, wow, like I'm really risking my life with some of this stuff. Maybe I should slow down. Maybe there is more to like building a future for myself. Because yeah, it can be very easy to like get into the way that psychedelics change your perspectives of time and space, and you can just start to sort of think of the world as your oyster all the time. When you're getting older,
Yep.
you know, you're probably going to want to eventually build a family. I mean, there's a lot of other things to life besides the universe, man.
Yeah. It's true. You can get lost in this. It's an easy journey, just like any other rabbit hole. You got to know how to look up and dig yourself out of it at some point and use it, make it practical.
Yeah, well, and just be moral with it.
Right.
You don't want to just let it be subsumed into sort of this amoral recreation that you're doing. And when I say moral, what I mean, I'm not a moral relativist, and I'm happy to argue with intellectuals about this. Morality at its core, I think, is a narrative. We define morality by, well, it's like, is something moral or immoral? Well, what story does it tell? And like, what is the story of going and getting fast food every day and eating it? Is cardiovascular disease and an early demise.
Yeah.
Obesity, exhaustion, suffering. That's the end of that story. Not a good story. It's not moral. It's immoral. Like, a lot of people don't think about it, but like, morality extends to the way you treat yourself. I had a friend who, she didn't treat herself very well, and I would talk with her about this sometimes. And one time she told me this story about a friend of hers who was just the most wonderful, generous person, blah blah blah. But she never had any time for herself, and she would always, like, she wouldn't eat enough, she wouldn't, like, whatever. And I told her, I was like, yeah, but she was being a terrible person to herself. Yeah. She wasn't looking after herself. And psychedelics can tell very, very profound stories. And I think we need some stories of our own destruction to play out in our real lives. I've certainly had some very, very fun self-destructive times with drugs, but at the end of the day, it's whenever you can come away from the process and know that what you've done will lead to something generative, will allow you to move forward with other parts of your life that build towards something greater. That's a really important part of it too. And young people aren't always about that, and I understand. I wish that we hadn't made these drugs illegal. I wish there was a way that they could be subsumed into our culture. The way that they are in tribal cultures, so that they have a healthier place that is in the sun instead of the shadows. And I think that we're getting there. I think that some of the work coming out, I mean, we've even got Ivy League universities, despite my disagreements with some of how those work, we have Ivy League universities starting to do studies with psychedelics for the treatment of different disorders. And I think that's getting well on the way to the point where we can say, well, you know what? everybody could, not everybody, but plenty of people, plenty of normal people have a right to try these things and to transform themselves. That I remember, I think it was Mexico when they decriminalized all drugs. It fascinated me. I read up on what the Mexican Congress had said, and they said that the reason they legalized all drugs is because human beings have a fundamental right to the transformation of their personality.
Wow.
I think that's what it was.
Wow.
And I remember being
That's
like,
unusual, a government saying that.
yeah, I remember just being like, what the heck, Mexico? Like, why would
What?
Mexico say? I don't know whether that was Mexico. It was like Brazil or Mexico, Colombia. It was some South American country
Right.
that had legalized all drugs or that had decriminalized all drugs. And it was like, yeah, like that's what it comes down to is that the reason governments hate these things is because they help people change, and because they help people change, people in general become harder to predict.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for a government, an unpredictable population is a dangerous population. And
Yeah.
we're getting to a point in society where we have enough going on that people can be a little bit more unpredictable. The thing is, at this point, I would say that really things like social media contribute way more to an unpredictable populace than psychedelics ever could. And
Yeah.
the government is obsessed with blowing those up bigger and bigger so that they can track people without realizing that it's driving all of society mad. So yeah, I don't think that I don't think that the case for psychedelics remaining illegal is very good, even though it does certainly cause people to question the system. So yeah, I guess to come back to harm reduction, that is the one other thing is these things are still illegal in a lot of places. Don't let it drive you nuts and make stupid decisions. Again, set and setting. Don't drive unless like you've come down and you're feeling very stable, you know. And the way I've always described it is just don't break more than one law at a time.
Right.
Is the way to do it. You know, like
One's enough.
If
One's
if you're gonna be on an illegal substance, then don't drive if you're impaired. Like just don't one law at a time. Some of them are stupid, yes, but that doesn't mean that you can just go and break a laundry list of them all at once and expect to have a life after that. Because that's the thing, is that, you know, you really don't understand the ramifications of getting caught up in the system until it happens. Because it's like one moment you're just, you know, ever since you've been a kid, you're just kind of going on with life and you don't have anything holding you back, and then suddenly it's like you've gotten caught in the conveyor belt gear of this giant sprawling system that is so big that for that system, years of your life are a meaningless consequence that it is simply going to impose on you. It's like, guess what? Here you are. This is going to be you for years. And like young people, it's just it's not an easy thing to wrap your head around, that it's like, oh no, like this is my life now. Probation is my life now. And a lot of people do not do well with that, and they will just keep you. And the way that system is designed is, I mean, to basically trap you in it until you age out of misbehavior. That's kind of fundamentally what happens with a lot of like career criminals. It's like they're just naughty until they reach like 45 or something, and then they're just too wiped out and tired to really do it anymore.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how the system's designed. It's just kind of keep you stuck in it, just keep you falling back down in, until you're not a threat.
Yep.
So
And that's why they don't want psychedelics to come out. That's why they don't want them in the public as much, is because they're more concerned about the stability of their system, and they have to do everything in their power. And I think they underestimate how much it's going to help the system. I think they really underestimate that. And I really want to say thank you, and that I want to get to closing up here in about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Because we've covered a lot, and we can pick up from this point here talking about like the laws and just like the stigma around it a little bit more in another episode. I'd absolutely love that, because that's a whole different conversation.
it is a whole other ballgame.
But this has been amazing. Thank you so much. Any final thoughts? Share them, and then we'll close up.
I guess I would just say that I would say that as far as when you're on psychedelics, it's always good to move towards love.
Yeah.
As just no matter how confused you are by them, no matter how outside of your ballpark you feel, move towards love for yourself, the people around you, even for the cop that's talking to you, because I've done that before and I've had very good interactions with police officers while completely out of my mind, is to move towards love, and that will end up seeing you to a brighter place, for sure.
That nailed it. Thank you so much. Let's pop up and talk with our buddy up there. This has been awesome. I can't wait to continue this discussion. This was really cool.
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
Hey, y'all take care.
All right. Later, guys.